Have you ever believed in something so deeply, so completely, that it almost felt like the world itself agreed with you, only for a single moment to shatter that belief as if it were made of glass? It is strange how one sentence, one gesture, one act of rejection can echo louder than 1,000 days of hard work. And for many Filipinos working overseas, that echo arrives not as a whisper, but as a door slammed shut. There has always been a quiet insult lingering in the background of our global story, an unspoken line repeated in offices, in crowded train stations, in diplomatic hallways. They said Filipinos were replaceable. They said it with a shrug, with a careless tone, as if the entire world had silently agreed on this idea long before it ever reached our ears. People whispered it as though it carried universal truth. They said no nation would ever truly need a Filipino, that if we disappeared, the world would barely notice. And what shocked many was not that strangers said it, but who echoed it. There was a moment, one that spread quietly online, when a foreign official, a respected figure in his own country, declared that removing Filipino workers would have minimal impact. He said it while adjusting his glasses, speaking with the confidence of a man who believed numbers more than people and statistics more than stories. But what if I told you that just a few months later, the same government that dismissed Filipinos would secretly scramble to address the damage caused by that decision? What if the world that once felt so certain, so arrogantly sure of its judgment, suddenly realized it had pushed away the very people holding its foundations together? Because behind every economy, every hospital ward, every hotel floor, every classroom, there was always a Filipino doing the silent, dignified work no one noticed, until it was gone. This is where our story begins, with a man named Elias Ramos. He was 42, soft-spoken, and wore humility the way others wore armor. He had spent more than a decade working abroad, in a country that treated efficiency as a religion and workers as numbers in a ledger. He washed dishes, repaired machinery, fixed the solar panels on rooftops no one else dared to climb. He sent money home like clockwork, refusing to miss a single remittance, even when he himself had nothing left but instant noodles for dinner. His daughter once asked him why he worked so far from home, and Elias replied with a smile that hid more than it revealed. Sometimes sacrifice is too heavy for a child to understand. Then came the morning that changed everything. A supervisor, barely older than his oldest son, handed him a folded paper without looking him in the eyes. It was an order of expulsion. No explanation. No apology. Just a cold decree wrapped in bureaucratic ink. The country had restructured its labor force, they said. Foreign workers, especially Filipinos, were to be removed. Elias stood in silence as the words blurred into one unbroken, heart-piercing message. You are no longer wanted here. The airport felt colder than winter as he boarded the flight home. Yet somewhere beneath the humiliation, a quiet ember remained unextinguished. Elias did not know it yet, but his journey back to the Philippines would become the very proof that a nation can kick out a Filipino, but it cannot escape the consequences of losing one. And as the plane lifted into the sky, his story, and the world's regret, was only beginning. The plane touched down in Manila just as dawn broke, and the soft light spilling through the cabin windows seemed almost too gentle for the heaviness Elias carried inside. He stepped onto Philippine soil with the strange mix of relief and defeat that only returning migrant workers truly understand. He had come home, yes, but not by choice. It felt like stepping back into a familiar embrace while still hearing the echo of the door that had slammed behind him. He wondered if people could sense it, the quiet shame of someone who left strong and returned wounded. Before he went overseas, Elias had been a mechanic in Cavite, earning just enough to keep the lights on. But when his wife grew ill with a sickness they didn't yet have the money to diagnose, he made the choice so many Filipinos make. He left. He chased the promise of a salary that could keep her alive and send the children to school. For years he balanced between exhaustion and purpose, sleeping in cramped quarters, waking before dawn, pushing his body because the world outside demanded it. Yet even as he worked, the illness grew. Treatment was too expensive abroad, too distant at home, and the questions kept piling faster than the answers. The burden became heavier each year, yet Elias never let himself break. He believed he could endure anything for his family, but nothing prepared him for the humiliation of being dismissed without reason. He had built solar grids more stable than the policies that expelled him. He had repaired machines more reliable than the promises given to migrant workers. In the weeks leading to his departure, he watched the workplace become colder. Doors began to close. Meetings happened without him. Even his supervisor, who once joked with him about basketball, avoided his gaze. There was no grand farewell, no recognition, just a silent message that he, and many like him, were no longer needed. Nations sometimes forget that the world they stand on is held together by hands they do not see. Back in the Philippines, the first few days felt heavy. The neighbors welcomed him warmly, but their kindness reminded him of how much he felt he had lost. His children hugged him tightly, not understanding why their father's smile looked tired. At night, he lay awake listening to the faint hum of jeepneys outside, wondering if he had failed. He had traveled oceans only to return to uncertainty. But something unexpected began to shift. On his third day home, he visited a small clinic run by Filipino volunteers to check on his wife's worsening condition. The doctor who greeted them spoke softly, holding Elias's gaze with genuine concern. There was no hurry in her voice, no judgment in her eyes. She was young, perhaps in her early 30s, yet carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who understood suffering far more deeply than her years suggested. She examined his wife with care that felt almost sacred. When Elias apologized for not having enough money yet, she simply placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We'll help you," she said. "We don't turn anyone away." The words stunned him. In the foreign land he had served for more than a decade, everything had a price. Compassion was measured in invoices. Time was calculated in productivity charts. But here, in this small room lit by flickering fluorescent lights, he found a kindness that felt strangely familiar, yet long forgotten. It was as if the Philippines, in its own humble way, was whispering to him, reminding him of a truth he had buried beneath years of survival. "You belong here. You are not a number here." Still, he hesitated to believe. One gentle encounter could not erase years of hardship. He wondered if this warmth was temporary, or if the Philippines could truly be the answer to the storm he had been carrying. And yet, as he walked out of the clinic holding his wife's hand, he couldn't ignore the quiet glow rising in his chest, a faint light breaking through the sorrow. He did not know it yet, but this was the first thread in a tapestry that would soon reveal something extraordinary. Something nations often realize only when it is too late. Elias was beginning to see it. The Philippines was not just a place to return to, it was becoming a place to heal. Elias woke the next morning feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope, that was still too fragile a word. It was more like a quiet easing in his chest, as if the Philippines itself had placed a warm hand over his heart and whispered that he could breathe again. The air seemed softer, the sounds of children playing outside strangely comforting. Still, he moved through the day carefully, afraid to trust anything too quickly. Life had trained him to expect disappointment, not gentleness. But the turning point began in the most unexpected place, a small church near the market where he took his wife for her follow-up checkup. They arrived early, and while waiting, he stepped inside the chapel to escape the heat. The moment he entered, something shifted. The space was almost empty except for an elderly woman lighting candles near the altar. The soft glow painted her face with a serenity that took him by surprise. She looked at Elias and smiled with the kind of smile that reaches the eyes, the kind that feels like an invitation to rest. No words were exchanged, yet something inside him loosened, as if a knot he had carried for years had begun to unravel. Later, at the clinic, the young Filipino doctor greeted them again. She hadn't forgotten his wife's name. She hadn't forgotten his either. She explained the treatment plan slowly, making sure they understood everything. She listened, truly listened, to their worries, something he rarely experienced overseas, where time was rationed like an expensive commodity. When his wife apologized for taking too long to speak, the doctor simply shook her head with gentle patience, saying, "Take all the time you need." That sentence alone felt life-changing. Not because of the words, but because of the way she meant them. As the weeks passed, Elias began noticing things he had once overlooked. On the jeepney rides home, strangers shared space without complaint. Vendors offered an extra piece of fruit when they saw his worry. His neighbors brought food not out of pity, but out of a natural instinct to care. It was as if the entire community, without being instructed, had decided that no one should feel alone. After years of living abroad, surrounded by efficiency but starved of humanity, he found himself overwhelmed by the quiet, consistent kindness of his own people. One afternoon, as he waited outside the clinic, he overheard two nurses talking in the hallway. They spoke about shortages, delayed supplies, long hours, and yet they laughed softly, choosing joy even in exhaustion. One of them said something that struck him deeply. "We do what we can because these are our people." The line echoed in his mind long after they left the room. In the foreign country that expelled him, he had been treated as temporary, disposable, a replaceable pair of hands. Here, even with limited resources, every small act seemed to whisper a very different truth. You matter. For the first time in years, Elias felt himself leaning toward hope. Not running toward it blindly, but reaching for it carefully, like someone touching a fragile relic with reverence. He had come home expecting only survival, maybe disappointment. Instead, he was discovering something far more powerful, a kind of compassion that didn't demand anything in return. In those early weeks, the Philippines stopped being simply the place he was born. It became something deeper, something he hadn't fully understood until he returned. It became the place where he felt human again. The days began blending into one another, not in monotony, but in a growing rhythm that felt strangely healing. Elias found himself waking before sunrise, stepping outside to breathe in the cool morning air as roosters crowed in the distance. There was something about the quiet moments of Manila dawn that steadied him, reminded him that even a wounded heart could find its way back to beating normally. Slowly, almost without noticing, his life was intertwining again with the life of the community around him. He started volunteering at the clinic on days when his wife didn't need treatment. It began with small things, carrying boxes of medicine, fixing the clinic's broken electric fan, arranging chairs before patients arrived. But the nurses treated him as though his contributions were far greater. They thanked him sincerely, offering him smiles that reminded him of something he had long forgotten: that dignity isn't given by institutions, but by the people who choose to see your worth. One afternoon, when the power flickered off during a downpour, the young doctor called out his name with a trust that startled him. "Elias, Can you check the backup generator?" It was such a simple request, yet he felt his throat tighten. No one had said his name like that in years, with confidence, with respect. As he repaired the generator, hands steady despite the storm outside, he felt a truth rising inside him. In the country that kicked him out, he had been invisible. Here, he was needed again. It wasn't the need of desperation or scarcity. It was the deeper kind, the need for presence, for participation, for the strength of a Filipino who understood hardship but chose compassion anyway. He found himself learning, too, learning how the nurses prayed quietly before each shift, learning how the doctor stayed long after hours to check on patients who had no money, learning how the community created small miracles every day, a neighbor offering home-cooked meals, a tricycle driver refusing payment from someone struggling, a group of volunteers teaching children after school, even when they themselves were exhausted. Every gesture, no matter how small, carried the same message. We take care of each other. One evening, as he walked his wife home under the warm glow of streetlights, he noticed something he hadn't seen in years. She was smiling, not the polite, forced smile she wore during her worst days abroad, but a gentle, content smile born from feeling safe. The illness was still there, but its grip seemed weaker, softened by the constant care surrounding her. She squeezed his hand and said softly, "I'm glad we're home." The words struck him deeper than she realized. For years he had believed that hope lay across the sea, that salvation existed only in the opportunities of another nation. Now, standing on a simple street in Manila, he felt that belief crumble in the most beautiful way. The transformation reached its peak one afternoon when the doctor gathered the volunteers and clinic staff to thank them for their service. She spoke passionately about resilience, community, and the power of choosing empathy even when resources were limited. Then she turned to Elias, calling him forward in front of everyone. "This man," she said, "has become the heart of this place." The room erupted in applause, but he stood frozen, overwhelmed. No foreign employer had ever spoken about him this way. No supervisor had ever looked at him with such genuine admiration. He felt tears gather unexpectedly. Not the tears of sorrow, but of rediscovered worth, the kind that comes when a man realizes he had not returned empty-handed after all. In helping others, in giving his hands and heart to this small clinic, he had found the part of himself he thought he lost overseas. "I have never seen this anywhere else," he whispered to himself that night. The Philippines restored something in him that no foreign land could replace. Not just pride, not just belonging, but a renewed belief in humanity itself. And for the first time in his life, Elias didn't dream of leaving again. He dreamed of staying. He dreamed of building something here. He dreamed of living, not just surviving. He finally felt at home. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Elias walked to the clinic each morning with a steadiness he hadn't known in years, his steps no longer weighed down by the fear of not being enough. The people there had become more than colleagues or neighbors. They had become a kind of family, bound not by blood, but by the simple decision to care for one another. His wife's health slowly improved, her energy returning in small but undeniable ways. There were days she laughed again, genuine laughter, light and unburdened, and each time he heard it, he felt something inside him mend. One afternoon, as he watched her chat with the nurses, he realized that the Philippines had done something profound. It hadn't only treated her illness. It had healed the wounds neither of them knew how to speak about. The shame of being unwanted abroad, the quiet loneliness of working in a place that only valued labor, not the soul behind it, the belief that survival required leaving home. All of it began to dissolve in the gentle embrace of a community that asked for nothing but sincerity in return. Elias found himself repairing more than generators and electric fans. He fixed chairs, repainted walls, helped reorganize the pharmacy shelves. Each act felt like stitching together pieces of the life he thought he had lost. And with every repaired object, every grateful handshake, every warm greeting, he felt the Philippines giving him back a sense of purpose that no foreign salary had ever provided. One evening, the young doctor approached him while he was sweeping the courtyard. She stood quietly for a moment, then said, "You know, we're lucky you came home." The words struck him with unexpected force. Luck. No one had ever used that word about him before. Not overseas, where he had been treated as a cog in a machine. Not in the years when he believed his worth depended on how much he could send home. Luck was something reserved for people admired, appreciated, needed. He didn't know how to respond. Instead, he simply nodded, feeling the warmth of her words settle into him like a deep, steady flame. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Elias looked around and understood the truth he had been circling for months. The Philippines had not merely welcomed him back, it had transformed him. It had taken a man who returned carrying humiliation and turned him into someone who stood with quiet pride. It had replaced shame with dignity, despair with purpose, fear with belonging. And then came the realization that carried both weight and clarity. The foreign nation that expelled him had lost more than a worker. It had lost a man who would have given everything. A man who worked with integrity, who showed up even on days he felt broken, who devoted years of his life to a place that never learned his name. That nation had believed Filipinos were replaceable. Now it was discovering, painfully, that they were not. Because when Filipinos leave, when they are pushed out or cast aside, they take with them not just labor, but warmth, loyalty, ingenuity, and a spirit of perseverance that cannot be replicated. As Elias walked home that night, passing families gathered for dinner and children playing on the streets, he felt a deep sense of peace. The world was full of turmoil, full of countries that treated people like numbers and forgot the value of humanity. Yet here, in the heart of the Philippines, he had found what so many nations search for and so few truly understand: compassion that doesn't need justification, community that doesn't disappear in crisis, hope that grows even in hardship. Filipinos are not just workers, they are healers, builders, lifelines, quiet forces that hold families, institutions, and entire nations together. And when a country loses them, it loses far more than it realizes. Elias knew this now. The world would eventually learn it too. As he stepped through the doorway of his home, greeted by the familiar warmth of the life he once feared he had failed to protect, he whispered a truth that rose from the deepest part of him. The Philippines didn't just bring me back, it brought me back to life. And somewhere, far beyond the ocean he once crossed, a nation was beginning to understand the cost of letting a Filipino go.